David Carter walked into the downtown bank wearing a crisp navy suit, holding a leather folder with months of planning inside. He had spent the last year perfecting his business plan, a tech incubator that would support underrepresented youth in the city. He knew the numbers, had letters of intent from local partners, and was more than ready to take the next step. But the moment he approached the teller window, the atmosphere shifted. The woman behind the glass, Brenda, glanced up from her screen, gave him a tight-lipped smile, and before he even spoke, seemed to have decided everything she needed to know. He began to introduce himself, to explain why he was there, but she raised a hand mid-sentence. "Let me stop you right there," she said flatly, her tone dismissive. "We don't typically offer loans for ideas that don't have a strong financial backing, especially not tech startups. They rarely succeed." She didn't ask for his plan, didn't check his credit, didn't even look past the cover page of the documents he gently slid forward. Her voice, sharp and loud, drew the attention of nearby customers. David could feel their eyes on him, their assumptions stacking onto hers. He kept his tone steady, trying not to let the heat in his chest rise to his face. He mentioned his degrees, his previous consulting work, the mentorship program he'd already piloted. But she was already pushing the folder back under the glass. "Maybe try again when you have some real traction," she said with a condescending shrug. David didn't argue. He simply gathered his things, stood tall, and walked out. Outside, he paused on the sidewalk, looking up at the building. The bank's logo gleamed above its marble entrance. For a moment, he stared at it. And then, quietly, he said to himself, "One day I won't need a loan. I'll buy the whole damn building." And with that, he walked away. Not defeated, but determined. A week had passed since David Carter was dismissed at the bank counter, like his dreams were worthless, but he hadn't wasted a single moment. He turned rejection into fuel, pouring his energy into everything he had built up until now. His business plan, a community tech hub designed to empower underrepresented youth through access to education, mentorship, and real-world digital tools, was already polished. What he needed now was leverage. If traditional banks wouldn't help, he'd build a new path. Every morning started early. David would rise before dawn, review pitch decks, scan grant deadlines, and comb through emails from potential contacts. He reached out to nonprofit foundations, local business groups, and minority-led entrepreneur networks. Some ignored him, some offered generic feedback, but a few opened doors. He wasn't looking for charity. He was offering a solid return, both financially and socially. Slowly, one coffee meeting at a time, interest grew. He spent afternoons visiting potential locations. Ironically, one of the buildings he'd toured was the same one housing the bank that dismissed him, an aging but iconic structure that had just been listed for sale. David took a long pause outside its doors, remembering the look on Brenda's face when she waved him off. He didn't let the memory sour his focus. If anything, it crystallized his next move. David's evenings were filled with virtual meetings, most of them with skeptical investors, but one in particular changed everything. Malik Granger, a former Silicon Valley executive now dedicated to investing in Black-owned ventures, had heard about David's project from a mutual contact. What began as a 15-minute chat turned into an hour-long conversation about legacy, community, and vision. Malik didn't just see a business plan. He saw fire, purpose, and clarity. 2 days later, Malik called back with a proposal. He would become David's lead investor. Armed with funding and legitimacy, David didn't waste time. Together with Malik and a small legal team, they made a quiet but serious offer on the downtown property. The owner, a real estate group eager to sell to someone with a revitalization plan, was impressed by David's community-focused vision. The deal began to move faster than anyone expected, and all the while David said nothing. No big announcements, no tweets, no public clapbacks. He just worked. In private, he imagined what it would be like to walk back into that bank, not as a borrower seeking permission, but as the owner holding the deed, not out of spite, but to show that being underestimated had never been his weakness. It had always been other people's blind spot. What began as a humiliating encounter was slowly becoming the start of something much greater. David wasn't just chasing approval anymore. He was building power, and soon he would own the very building that once tried to shut him out. The purchase moved forward with remarkable speed. Within weeks, all the paperwork was signed, the inspections cleared, and the downtown property officially belonged to a new development group. one quietly led by David Carter. The very building that had housed the bank where he'd been dismissed was now under his ownership, and no one inside that bank had the faintest idea. David didn't immediately announce his presence. Instead, he focused on what came next. He met with architects, interior designers, and community leaders to begin planning the transformation of the upper floors into a tech incubator and co-working space. The first floor would remain leased to existing businesses, including the bank. That detail in particular he left untouched for now. Word began to spread in the business community about the sale. Rumors buzzed through office halls, especially in the bank's break room. The tellers and managers heard vague mentions of a new owner and speculation about rent increases or renovations, but no names were revealed. Brenda, the same teller who had rejected David so coldly, joked to a colleague one morning that whoever bought the building was probably another out-of-touch developer with no clue what the neighborhood needs. Meanwhile, David continued to visit the site regularly, not in a flashy way, but with quiet authority. He would walk the halls with engineers and designers, discussing floor load capacities and fiber optic rewiring. On one visit, he passed by the bank lobby. Brenda didn't recognize him, or pretended not to, as she glanced up briefly before turning back to her screen. David said nothing. He didn't need to. What amused him wasn't revenge. It was irony. The same building where his ideas had been rejected was now the foundation for his vision. The space that had been gatekept was now his to open to others, and soon the people who had overlooked him would have no choice but to look up, both literally and figuratively. As the renovations began on the upper floors, David stood in the future office of his incubator and gazed out over the city skyline. The windows were dusty, but he could already see the future clearly. The concrete, the glass, the history. It all belonged to him now. And the best part? He hadn't changed to fit their mold. He had succeeded entirely on his own terms. The renovation crews had been working for weeks, and the upper floors of the building were slowly transforming into the modern, innovative space David had envisioned. Bright collaborative areas, sleek offices, and a state-of-the-art tech lab were beginning to take shape. Downstairs, however, the bank remained untouched, business as usual. The employees still had no idea that every file they filed and every customer they greeted was being done under the roof of a new owner. But that was about to change. One crisp Monday morning, David arrived for a scheduled walkthrough with the building's property manager. This time, he wasn't in jeans and a hoodie like during previous visits. Today, he wore a tailored gray suit and carried a leather portfolio. As he entered through the front doors, the sun lit up the gold-lettered placard recently installed beside the entrance. Carter Commons, a David Carter development. The bank staff hadn't noticed it yet. As David crossed the marble lobby, Brenda looked up from her station. Her brow furrowed slightly. She seemed to recognize him but couldn't place him. She offered a hesitant smile. "May I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but still slightly stiff. David returned the smile, calm and assured. "I have a meeting upstairs, but I'll be stopping by the branch manager's office shortly." Brenda blinked. "Oh, you're with one of the contractors?" "No," David replied evenly. "I'm the new owner of the building. I'm here to discuss your lease renewal." Her face went pale. For a moment, she said nothing, her fingers frozen above the keyboard. Then she stammered, I didn't realize, I mean, congratulations?" David nodded graciously. "Thank you." He didn't need to say more. Her eyes said everything, recognition, disbelief, a flicker of guilt. The memory of how she dismissed him resurfaced in her face like a shadow. But David didn't linger. He walked past her with purpose, his steps echoing softly across the lobby's polished floor. In the manager's office, the mood was tense. David was cordial, professional, but firm. He reviewed the bank's lease and discussed adjustments, a modest rent increase and, more notably, a proposal for the bank to participate in a new community equity initiative. If they wanted to remain in the building, they'd need to align with the inclusive mission of Carter Commons. The manager agreed. What else could he do? David had the leverage now. When the meeting ended, David walked back through the lobby. Brenda glanced up again, her eyes softer this time. She didn't speak, and neither did he. But in that moment, the power dynamic had quietly reversed. And David, the man once refused a simple chance, was now the one holding the keys. A few weeks later, the lobby of the building had been entirely refreshed. The old sterile walls had been repainted with warm earth tones, local artwork lined the entryway, and new signage made it clear that this was no longer just another corporate building downtown. It was Carter Commons, a place of progress and inclusion. But the bank remained in place, and David had no plans to evict them. Instead, he wanted to make a point, one built on visibility, not vengeance. On a Friday afternoon, the bank was busier than usual. Customers formed a small line at the teller windows. Brenda stood at her usual post, checking IDs and sliding forms beneath the glass. She had become quieter in recent days, especially since learning who now owned the building. She hadn't spoken of her past encounter with David, but the tension was there, unspoken and heavy. Then, David walked in. This time, he didn't come alone. Flanked by two team members and a local journalist covering the building's redevelopment, David walked through the doors with quiet confidence. He wasn't there for show. He was there to share the progress of the Tech Hub project with the public and thank local partners for their support. Brenda saw him immediately. Her posture stiffened. Their eyes met, and this time, she looked away first. David walked over to the front desk, where the journalist snapped a few discreet photos. The lobby, once cold and impersonal, now buzzed with curiosity. Bank staff peeked out from their offices, whispering. Brenda stood still behind her glass partition, unsure whether she should say something, apologize, or disappear. David approached the center of the lobby and spoke to the gathered crowd about the building's transformation. He talked about creating opportunity, shared his story briefly, and thanked the city for supporting his vision. He never mentioned the rejection, never called out the teller, but he didn't have to. Everyone in the room could feel it, the full circle moment. After the short speech, he walked by the teller windows on his way out. Brenda offered a faint smile, almost an apology in her eyes. "Mr. Carter," she said softly. He paused. "Yes?" "I just wanted to say, congratulations." David held her gaze for a moment. "Thank you," he said kindly. "It's only the beginning." And with that, he walked out, leaving behind the echo of a moment that would stay with her far longer than the sound of the closing door. As spring turned to summer, Carter Commons officially opened its upper floors to the public. The ribbon-cutting ceremony drew a crowd of city officials, local business owners, nonprofit leaders, and dozens of young aspiring entrepreneurs, the very people David had designed the space for. The energy in the air was electric. Cameras flashed, speeches were made, and tour groups moved through the newly transformed floors, marveling at the sleek co-working spaces, tech labs, and mentorship lounges. David stood on the main stage, poised behind a podium bearing the Carter Commons logo. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, no tie, and his presence commanded attention without effort. He spoke about access, not just to capital, but to dignity, about breaking cycles of exclusion and reshaping who gets to sit at the table. His words weren't bitter, they were bold. This wasn't about revenge. It was about rewriting the rules. Meanwhile, inside the bank downstairs, Brenda watched from behind the glass as the lobby buzzed with unfamiliar energy. She hadn't been invited, of course. This wasn't her space anymore, not the way it used to be. She had overheard colleagues talking about David's story in pieces, whispering about what had happened months ago. A few even joked that she must feel pretty dumb now. She didn't laugh. That evening, after the crowds dispersed and the media left, David remained behind, walking the hallways slowly, taking it all in. The building now bore his name. But more than that, it bore his vision. One that didn't just renovate walls and floors, but redefined who belonged within them. He paused near a framed mission statement in the entrance corridor. This space is for the voices that were once talked over, the dreams once dismissed, and the people once ignored. He thought of Brenda, of the moment she had slid his documents back under the glass without reading them. He thought of all the others like her, not out of hatred but out of habit, who couldn't see beyond what they expected him to be. Now, whether they liked it or not, they had to see him for exactly what he was. Not just the owner of the building, a builder of something bigger. Months later, Carter Commons had become more than just a building. It was a landmark of change in the city. Startups launched from its offices were getting traction. Youth programs were thriving. And David was now being recognized not only as a successful entrepreneur, but as a community leader. Local news outlets ran stories about him. National platforms began to take notice. His vision had grown beyond the building. He was being invited to advise other cities on how to replicate the model. One afternoon, David returned to the lobby to meet with a potential partner. As he waited near the front, Brenda approached him slowly, no longer behind her glass window, but standing on equal ground. She looked nervous, but composed. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice quiet but clear, "do you have a moment?" He turned to her, calm and open. "Of course." She hesitated. "I owe you an apology for the way I treated you. Back then, I didn't try to see. I judged you before you even had a chance." David studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I appreciate you saying that. I've thought about that day a lot," she continued, "and I've been trying to be better since. I joined one of the finance workshops upstairs on my lunch breaks. I've been learning about business, investing, and people." A small, genuine smile formed on David's face. "That's good to hear." She offered a faint smile of her own. "Thank you for giving this city something it didn't even know it needed." As she turned to go, David called after her gently. "Brenda." She looked back. "Keep going," he said. "Growth looks good on you." She nodded, then returned to her desk, not just as a teller, but as someone who had started her own journey toward change. David turned toward the elevators, stepping into the space he built. Not to prove anyone wrong, but to show what was always possible when you refused to be defined by someone else's limitations. He didn't need validation anymore. He had legacy,